Hi, and welcome to the Vocal Fries Podcast, the podcast about linguistic discrimination.
I'm Carrie Gillen.
And I'm Megan Figueroa. And happy belated birthday, Carrie.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I remember that. I know, it's like...
Barely. I mean, how many things have happened between last week and this week?
It wasn't even 7 days yet. Hasn't it been like 5 days since your birthday? Wait, no, it has been a week. Oh my god, time...
Nope, 5 days is right.
Oh, it's been 5 days? Yep.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right. Yeah, and we lost one of the Supreme Court justices.
Yeah. We're almost at 200,000 deaths in the U.S.
I'm pretty sure
we're over, yeah.
Already. Regardless of what the official number is, I'm certain that there are at least some that haven't been counted yet.
Absolutely.
Because it takes a long time to actually make sure that a death is really a COVID death, and, you know, it's a complicated process, and by the time we hear the numbers...
Yeah. It's like when we see a star and realize how long ago the light was from. Yeah.
Yes. That reminds me. So one thing that was kind of exciting about the last week was that there was this dwarf star and a planet, and the planet is like 10 times the size of the star or something, and it's really strange, but it kind of makes sense because dwarf stars are collapsed stars, so they're much smaller. But that was kind of a fun piece of news.
Yeah. Yes, astronomy is still awesome. It still makes me wonder. There's still more to learn and more to see. I don't know. Maybe there's some hope in astronomy.
It feels apolitical, even though, like, nothing literally is. But, you know, it just feels like it's outside of this political moment we're in. And also, the reason why I bring it up is that it's 80 light years away. So that means it happened 80 years ago, what we're seeing. So.
No. It's like one of the things I remember from astronomy class is that what you're seeing is not what's happening right now.
Yeah. Which is mind-bending.
It's chilling. It's chilling. Yeah, no, it's hard to get on the microphone. It's hard to get on the mic and talk about things when I feel like the world is collapsing around me. But we get up. I'm upright. Here I am. A lot of bad things have happened since you had a birthday. And even more bad things have happened since I had a birthday in July. It just keeps on...
Yeah.
Piling up.
It is piling up.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't call it fun news, but, you know, I'm pretty excited about it. We have a webinar coming up.
Yes.
Yeah. And here's my favorite part before I tell you what it's about. Everyone in it was a previous guest on the show.
That is so true. It's hilarious. Although that's partially because the person organizing it was a guest, and then when she asked for suggestions, I suggested 2 of her former guests. So
yes, I mean, yeah, I always suggest them. I hope that they'll say no when they need to say no to things. But anyway. I obviously was just hoping they would do it. I wasn't expecting them to. So October 16th, the LSA is hosting a webinar on being a linguist on social media. Yes. And it's going to be very Twitter-centric. So we've been talking about Linguist Twitter. But it'll be with us and doctors Nicole Holliday and Betsy Sneller and PhD candidate Kelly Wright. And Betsy is the one who's organizing it, and it's very exciting. Just, you know, come for us. We're enough of a draw, right? All 5 of us. That's, I mean, who knows what you're going to learn? Something. You will.
A power quintuplet.
Exactly. So that's really fun. I'm really excited about that. With all the work I'm doing or whatever, it's like, oh, to work on this, it feels like a bright spot. So October 16th. We'll post a link to that. Speaking of Linguist Twitter, we don't want to say much about what's happening on Linguist Twitter right now. No. Besides to say that perhaps Gritty could do 2 jobs. And one of them could be to be the face of linguistics now.
Oh, wow. Would I love it for Gritty to be the linguistics mascot. I mean, it's still, you know, American-centric.
Yes, it is.
Sports-centric. But he's just
orange-centric.
So
he's so great. He's not divisive. Maybe he is. I don't know.
I'm sure there's some people who do not like him, but they're probably Nazis.
Yeah, exactly. Literally. Maybe linguistics doesn't need a mascot. I've never been about team sports, so I don't understand the appeal of a mascot anyway. Right, I don't have the bandwidth
I'm like, there's so much happening.
I feel like even at the best of times, I would be like, really? Can we just not?
Yeah, exactly. I don't know. I could draw something in 2 seconds that we could use if we want. I'm like thinking about how like not intricate the wug is and how simple it is, and it's like,
right.
You know, I don't know. It's also bizarre to me.
Chris was trying to convince me to come up with a wug replacement,
so he could do it. So he could draw it.
Yeah, like any one of us could draw it because you're right. It's really simple, right? Like,
right.
But he was just trying to convince me to do it, and I'm like, like, do I just, like, replace it with a word that is very similar? Like,
right.
Or...
But then it still would be English-centric, Germanic-centric. The phonotactics don't work in other languages. The sound sequences. Yeah. Or maybe it would just be in an image. Maybe it would not have a name. Can a mascot not have a name?
No. And also, doesn't that feel very anti-language?
Oh, right, language. That's what we're talking about.
I mean, it could have a sign.
Well, that's
how
bizarre.
Sign would still be associated with something, right? I don't know.
That's how bizarre I think it is to have a mascot. So I'm just like, let's just not. It doesn't need a name because linguistics doesn't need a mascot anyway. So it's so bizarre that I don't know.
Right?
I guess
does physics
there has
have
to be
a
some
mascot?
sort of language.
Like, do other fields have mascots? I don't think so, right?
No.
And I mean, partially it was just because that's what people adopted, and I don't want to shit on people for adopting what they
No,
right?
of course not. It's for adopting it because it's cute, because it's really cool,
it is cute.
And we still use the pedagogy today. We can use it in different languages and in different modalities too. You just have to change the word, and absolutely. Yeah. Maybe a year ago, if you would have asked me, I would have been like, yeah, of course the wug is our mascot. But
no, I never.
No, I wouldn't have. I know. I'm trying to look at me trying to backpedal about the wug. That's how controversial it is right now. It's so hard to say anything. Yeah. This might, of all of our like 100 episodes, I don't know how many we're on. This might be the most controversial intro ever.
Seriously.
Yeah. Well, here's our advice: stay away from linguist Twitter right now until this calms down. Oh,
I mean, I have felt like the last day or two, I haven't seen the talking about it. So.
Because Justice Ginsburg died. It's like I feel like no one really cares about the wug right now. It's hard to care.
Maybe we can move on to something more interesting, more important.
Even maybe uplifting. That might be nice.
Yeah.
For a change.
Uplifting linguistic stories would be good.
Yeah.
Feel free to send us any.
Yeah, exactly. Please share with us anything that feels uplifting related to language. I'm excited, though, about today's episode because this person has been a friend of the pod forever. Mm-hmm. And I'm glad that we were able to speak to him finally about his work. Yes.
So it's a good conversation.
It's a good conversation and a necessary conversation. I always say this, but it's like it would have been necessary yesterday, 10 years ago, tomorrow. So, it was good to talk to him about this. So, hope you enjoy.
Like this show and want to make your own? Let me tell you about Anchor. It's free, and they have creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. And now you can even add any song from Spotify directly to your episodes. The possibilities are endless for what you can create, whether it's music analysis, your own radio show, or something the world's never heard before. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. And you can also make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. So download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started.
So today we're very excited to have JP Gerald, who is an adult educator and ed.D student at CUNY Hunter College, pursuing a degree in instructional leadership. His scholarship focuses on the intersection between language, teaching, race, and whiteness. He's also the host of the podcast Unstandardized English, and I dare say, a friend of the pod. So thank you so much for being here with us.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for having me on here. This is sort of it's like meeting your hero situation.
Because
I started my podcast after listening to yours for a while, and also as I tell this story on my podcast, because my wife just kept hearing me talk and said, Justin, you should just have a podcast too. So
yes. It was a way that she's like, I love everything you say and love to hear from you, but maybe other people want to hear.
Right. That's the way I choose to take it.
Yes. So speaking of, tell us about your podcast. What's it about?
So originally I had this very specific and narrow goal, which was I was going to take like a word or a phrase or a few words or phrases, and I was going to talk about how words that seemed race neutral, right? I know nothing is, but to people seem race neutral, and talk about how they weren't and how we should think about how we use these words, right? So like the first episode was about the word expat and how like, what is really the difference between expat and immigrant, right? Like what's really the difference when you think about it? So I talked about that with a friend, in the first episode.
Is the answer whiteness?
Yeah, I mean, basically. Right. Yeah, right. And then the thing about it is, as you mentioned, the more I started talking about this stuff, the more I sort of got, let's just say, distracted, and floated off into race and whiteness. So it's not just about language, but because I'm still a language teacher at heart, it's still all tied to language in some way, although not quite as much in the like discourse analysis linguistic side as some folks that you've all had on the show, because I'm a language teacher more than anything else. It still comes back to language in some way every time.
And why did you name your podcast Unstandardized English?
I was going through a bunch of ideas for what to call it, because I don't know. I'm thinking I'm still 11 years old in a lot of ways, because I always come up with the title of things before. I'm like, good title. Now let me write that.
Yes.
And the title's important.
I have a name for a band and I don't have any talent. It's like it's that kind of thing.
I used to make up movies when I was a kid and who was going to star in them. I wouldn't write the movies. I just imagine the credit sequence.
Exactly.
I'm not joking. It's not a joke.
You had like the soundtrack listings. You're like, I know exactly the songs.
Yeah, I would look up who are editors, and I would write up who anyway.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. Wow.
Yeah, exactly. I still, not that anyone's going to the movies right now, but I still would like sit and watch the credits just to see the order of the way the thing. I still do this now. Anyway, so I was coming up with ideas, and I was thinking, like, what do we even call this language that we use, right? And I was going back and forth. Was it like, do I call it like dominant English? Are we calling it like American? What should we call it? And then I sort of got around to standardized because, I'm sure you all know this, but like thinking about just calling it standard just takes out the fact that people made these decisions and imposed them upon people for using the language. And so if that was standardized, I said, what if it was unstandardized? And then that's how it came about. I said, I'm going to try and fight against the decisions that the dominant groups made in putting the language together.
Is there a particular reason why right now is a good time for your podcast to be out there?
The summer of 2019, before I started the podcast, because it started at the end of last summer, I started working on an article that got published later. And I wrote that summer. And that article was about like altruism, and we'll talk about it a little bit. But and as I was going through that, I realized that there is now, of course, you've had, Dr. Flores and Dr. Rosa on the show. There is now a fair amount of discussion aligning race and language teaching, right? And I don't mean to say that that is finished, but in talking about these things with people, they still were externalizing all of the issues. Like, that's a problem, this racism. And I'm like, yes. And they're like, yes, all those racists over there, that's a problem. And I'm like, okay, but wait a second now. And people never wanted to think about, possibly being complicit in it. And people also got really, really uncomfortable if I even said the word white. And I wasn't even really talking about it at the time. It's just mentioned, talking about, established frameworks like, privilege and so on and so forth. And so every time I got to like the third rail, which is the New York subway way to say something like, just really popping off, people got deeply in their feelings. And I said, okay. And then in one of those sad accidents of history, I had a second article published. I wrote it in January of 2020, so it had nothing to do with any of the stuff that was going to happen. And then it got published at the end of May, and that article was more specifically about decentering whiteness in English language teaching. And we all know what was happening at the end of May. And so all of a sudden, everybody really wanted to talk to me about it. Having decided as a means of trying to stay stable in New York in March and April to record a blistering number of podcast episodes consecutively. I think I had 12 weeks in a row where I had an episode. When I ran out of energy, which I did eventually, in June, I took the summer off saying I'm going to come back and I'm going to, make the show better and so forth. So now, we're starting up. By the time this comes out, we'll be in towards the beginning of the second season. And there's a lot of things happening related to whiteness that people have wanted to talk about. So I think right now, if I can toot my own horn, which I have been asked to do, it's a good time to check in on it. And you can look at the back episodes when I'm not sure what I'm doing, but
Yeah, so exactly. We will share links to your podcast and all of that. But let's shift gears a little bit so we can talk about your scholarship and your teaching.
Yeah, so why do you think that people are getting so up in their feelings about even just the word white, like even just being mentioned? What's going on there?
Yeah, there's one of the articles that I wrote, but that I found really useful by Bree Pickauer was talking about how white teachers, when they're confronted with whiteness, and I'm mostly talking about teachers, but it's not just teachers, will often fall back on like an ethnicity so that they don't have to identify with whiteness, right? They'll say, oh, well, I'm Italian. Well, I'm Irish, or, I'm not picking on those things. They're just places. I think because the people who have made a point of identifying as white have usually been very scary. Like, people are just like, I'm white first, and you're like, whoa, okay now. And you're just like, all right, sure. Okay. And which, so like, if I were white, I would understand why I wouldn't want to be talking, making a lot of noise about being white. But the problem is they're still white. So like, you can't, I don't know if I saw this image a few months ago, people trying to like renounce their white privilege in Los Angeles or something like that. It's like,
oh God, yes.
Oh, yeah, you can't.
I saw that.
You can't do that. It doesn't work that way. You can't like pull a Rachel Dolezal.
Right.
I think a lot of it, to give it a charitable spin, is that a lot of people are just deeply uncomfortable with what it means to be white. Because even if they don't feel complicit in a lot of the stuff that's been always going on, they think that by saying out loud, yeah, I'm white, it means that they'll be, tagged with guilt and tagged with, an anchor of all of the stuff that's happening. And that is a necessary first stage to deal with. But then the problem is that to get sort of stuck there is really where we end up. Because these are people who, again, to be charitable, are often well-meaning and kind in their hearts. But, they don't want to feel like the bad guy or the bad lady. I don't know what the opposite of bad guy is.
And what I've noticed, too, is that white people are getting uncomfortable with other white people calling them white. I think that's new. A little bit new. Like, they've always been uncomfortable with non-white people calling them white, I think. But now it's like, I don't know, there's this whole thing with like, just like what you said, what's happening, that it's even crossed over to like other, like in-group uncomfortable feelings. And it's good though. Other white people should be calling out other white people for all this kind of stuff. So maybe that's why it's kind of new too, is because white people haven't been doing this work before and calling it out.
They don't have the muscles built up to sort of, so they start running and they're like, I'm tired. But like, we have been doing this for hundreds of years. You're going to have to keep going. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And the fact that they're now, getting it from all sides, like where other white people who have done a little bit more of the work are calling them out for it. Like it's easy enough to just ignore us. It's easy enough to just like, the black people are complaining about racism, so we don't need to pay attention to them. But it's more difficult when your friend or your colleague or your relative is like, you really shouldn't be doing that. It's like I thought this was a safe space for me where I could just be white and not talk about it.
Exactly. Like, I thought we didn't talk about being white, right? It's just the default. So why are we bringing it up?
I'm speaking of well-meaning people because I don't, although the people who are not well-meaning are very loud and all over the news, it's still mostly people who are well-meaning and are just sort of heading in the wrong direction, I think, most of the time. Maybe I'm just Pollyanna about it. But I remember calling somebody out for something and mentioning that she was white and her saying, what does my race have to do with it? I mean, I just didn't respond after that, but you have to like modulate yourself and decide if you're going to continue to engage and that was just the whole thing. But now I wouldn't have modulated. I would have just kept going.
Right. Yeah, no, we all have to learn like when to push and when to not. And we should be pushing more than we have been probably.
Especially white people.
White people, yes. But yeah, like I think you're right to target people who do mostly mean well, because what are we going to do with the absolute, like, complete white supremacists? Not a whole lot. Like that we're talking deprogramming on a different level. And I don't know about you, but I do not feel up to that task at all. Worming my way into like well-meaning people's brains and helping them get a little bit better, I feel more comfortable in that zone.
Yeah, I don't really know what to do about that. But the thing is, there's always going to be a few people like that. So I'm not saying I'm not concerned about them. The people, you can't even really have a conversation with them. What's the purpose? And I don't mean, when I say conversation, that you're going to resolve the issues with whiteness just by talking. So when I say that, because some people, he said conversation. No, that's not what I'm saying. Because there's some people who, we'll just debate. And it's just like, no. But I do think that like you do have to speak to people in some way or engage with them in some way. And if they basically reject the premise that you're a human, well then...
There's no point.
Yeah. How are you going to get anywhere with them, for sure? Yeah.
I mean, that's how I feel about it. And I'm still white, but I'm a woman. Some of these people, the way they talk about women makes me not want to talk to them either, because I don't think they think of women as humans either.
Nope.
Anyway, so let's go back to whiteness. So you talk about heretical whiteness. What is that?
Oh, yeah. That's a thing that I was thinking about, which I'm going to write more about in the fall, actually. It's... I guess when you say heretical, right, you're making a metaphor of like a religious experience, right, or something like that, because heresy is like going against, sort of a religious belief, but like not just going against it, like not just like being, an atheist or something like that, but like literally turning back against the religious belief and saying and calling it out and say, no, I don't believe. Well, I feel like you can use, there are so many metaphors for whiteness. I mean, Leonardo has a list of them. But the one that I keep coming back to is thinking of it as, because it's an ideology, more than it is a skin color. I mean, yes, the skin color is important, but you know what I'm saying. You have to turn back on what you've been raised in and call out the issues with it directly. That doesn't mean, like, if you were actually talking about religion, like, it doesn't mean if you're doing that in Catholicism that you aren't Catholic. It means you're pointing out, like, hey, look what's happening here in the church. This is a huge problem. And I think that to be heretical in this metaphor is just to say that, like, no, I'm not going to be comfortable just trying to make small reforms in the way whiteness affects people. It's like the foundation is built on, trying to separate itself from other groups of people, right? Not all white people, hashtag not all white people, but, because somebody's gonna, hey, wait, that's not what I said. And I don't mean like the lightest skinned people, right? I don't necessarily mean like Scandinavians or something. I don't know. But I'm saying like, I'm specifically talking about like, reading all this stuff about how whiteness was created and maintained since like the 16th century or whatever, like, they're just making up arguments for why they're better than people. Like that's they're just making these things up, and they're still arguing about it. And you know, you have to call that out to say, like, wait a second, at no point was there a legitimate basis for this to be created other than to subjugate people, right? Some people take that too far, and I mean, to say, like, because race is not biological, then we should never speak of it. It's like, yeah, okay, but it's here, so we can't just, like, pretend it's not here.
Yeah, it's socially real, no matter what we talk,
The power is there, the power construct exists. So if we just pretend it's not there, it's not going to make these things go away.
No.
That would be nice, though.
It would be nice. If not seeing color really was a working strategy, sure, but no.
So what are some of the ways that white fragility show up in English language teaching?
This whole thing started with that, right? With not just white fragility, but like there's just white feelings that I had not even tried to elicit. This whole turn towards looking at whiteness in language teaching started, I had a very small survey that I sent out right when I first started listening to your podcast, actually. Just at the same, it didn't have anything to do with that, but anyway. And I sent it to the fellow graduates of my master's program because I thought that they would respond. And I asked them some simple questions that had no judgment in them, but they were just like, do you talk about race in the classroom? Right? And the thing is, if they said no, I wouldn't have been mad. I just wanted to know. So some of them said yes, some of them said no. But what was interesting was among the people who said yes, right, then there was a follow-up question. I said, okay, so how? I mean, I didn't write it that way. Give me an example. What do you do in the classroom when you teach race? And they would all start saying, well, I just like to mix the cultures. And I'm just like, that's not what I asked you. There's a lot to be said about that phrase, but, and just like what these people are saying. But I said, okay. So then I started to ask, teachers about that. And most of the time what happened, when they get really uncomfortable, is that they either change the subject, or they find a way to, and I use this word deliberately, to denigrate me in some other way, right? So most of the time they don't just come back and argue with my point. Maybe that's because I think I make the point well, but they usually don't want to have an argument about me pointing out that, whiteness shows up in teaching or whatever. But they'll find some other way to basically, be demeaning. And it's like if we were doing a scientific experiment, you couldn't call it cause and effect, but it just seems to correlate. It just happens afterwards somehow. So like I remember I said I was talking about whiteness in language teaching, talking about race in language teaching, and a person goes, interesting topic. And then 10 minutes later is saying things like, when we started, allowing more people of color into the class, the work, was less good. And I'm just like,
no.
I don't know why you brought that up just now, but it seems like I got you thinking about race, and then you really felt like you needed to tell me that.
It's really interesting that they tell so much about themselves. There's like, the smart way, if you got those horrible thoughts in your head, is to keep them quiet. But no, they feel the need to tell you. It's interesting.
Well, they don't know it's horrible. They somehow think they're adding something to the conversation.
I think there's also this idea that like when they present something that they consider to be a fact, right?
Yeah,
it can't be argued with. So in their mind, based on whatever assessment they were doing in the class, that these students did less well. And I'm sure, based on whatever assessment they gave them, that those students did less well, right? I'm sure that whatever test or whatever thing, those students got lower numbers. And so therefore, first of all, I wasn't there, so I can't say, actually, they did better on the test, right? Also, because I wasn't there, I can't say, well, maybe you shouldn't have assessed them that way, So like putting me in a position where I can't say, actually, those students didn't do more poorly on the test or whatever, so I just have to nod and be like, okay, if you want to say that. So, I mean, like, those are just some ways that it's shown up personally for me. Generally speaking, though, like more broadly in language teaching, I think that a lot of the ways is that people just don't want to examine themselves. And that's really where it shows up, because very rarely am I pointing my finger directly at one person. Even if I'm talking to one person, at least unless I'm really mad, I'm not going up to one person and saying, this is bad, don't do that. I'm saying, let's think about this field, this industry, and how these things manifest. But as soon as I do that, they'll either do what Bonilla Silva calls with discursive buffers. They'll bring up some other form of oppression. And then I have to be like, of course, that is also important. So then we're talking about that. Like, I had one person and I was just like, yeah, so we really need to think about whiteness and race in language teaching. And she's like, also religion. And I'm like, yes.
Really? That's interesting. I wouldn't think of that one naturally. You know, like gender and sexuality. Those things I can understand. But religion, what?
Yeah. Well, she was trying to make a point about discrimination against Muslim students, right? But
okay.
I mean, yes, this is a problem. It's not really a different problem.
Right, exactly.
You're almost there. Yes,
almost,
right,
yeah.
But when people do that, and they start to talk about other forms of oppression, it's you get caught up in it, because what am I supposed to say? No, don't care about other oppression. Don't care about it.
Right.
Now, when people do that, if I were to make that point, I would back up and say, well, let's think about it. How many of these things aren't tied to whiteness in some way? In fact, that's one way I started talking more about whiteness than just race, because, when I say whiteness, people think I'm talking just about race, but I'm not, because it's not just about race, right? It's about power, and it's about class, because remember that, the people who have the power don't actually care about white people without money either. They don't care about them, even though they're lying to them to tell them so. They don't particularly care about white women, although, a
little bit more.
Yeah, a little bit more. It's not just a color thing.
Right.
So now that I've spent more time thinking about it, I'm able to respond to that. I'm more on my toes about it. But generally speaking, at least in the past, when we were out in the world and all that, people would just try to distract. They would try to externalize things, like I said earlier, and they would try to minimize it, or they would just say things like my coworker said, where I told her what I was working on. She said, that sounds interesting, and turned away. So.
Right. There's the deflection, right?
Yeah.
It's just deflecting, because you're getting a little bit too close to their feels, their uncomfortable feels.
I really do think it's very important that we all switch to talking about whiteness. I think you're actually completely right. But race obviously is a component of it, but it's so much bigger than that, and it's really about us. Than it, right? White people are the problem, so we really do need to interrogate it that way. So.
And to add to that, because what whiteness is, there's how many books? I'm not going to. It's not going to be one sentence. Yeah. But one of the big things that whiteness is anti-blackness, right? This big part, whiteness was created so that black could be created, so that it could be oppressed, right? And people will say, well, what about other races? It's wait, I didn't get to my point yet. It's that one of the big things that happens is people will say, well, what about, and they'll list this officer, they'll list George Zimmerman, they'll list these people who aren't white, who are doing anti-black things. And it's but if this dude is running around the town trying to be a cop, he's trying to get into the whiteness. So even though he himself is not white, doing things in service of whiteness, the whiteness itself is still very important, even if the person isn't white. So that's why when I present on these things, I say that we may or may not all be white. We're not all white, but you know what I'm saying. Even if we're not white, we could be perpetuating the power of whiteness. And because otherwise, that's how you end up with people saying, well, I don't know what to do. We'll just hire this black person and then the problem is solved. And it's like, okay, but like Ben Carson is in the cabinet. So, you know.
I know, I was going to say, it's like a Ben Carson situation. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
They just bring him out. They're like, see, we have one. We have one.
Right. Yep.
Oh, and Tim Scott.
Yeah.
We got 2 now.
Oh no, they had one on every night in the convention.
Oh, did they? I
didn't watch it. I just read about it, and and they have them on talking about how not racist things are. So
Yep.
just doing the tap dance. But anyway,
So how are all of these things that we're talking about, how is this white fragility harming racialized students and ultimately like the bigger fight for anti-racism in English language teaching?
one of the big problems for the students is that the white teachers, but also the teachers who are doing things in service of whiteness, it causes this, since you can't be questioned on these parts of your identity, right? It also means you feel you have a larger authority than you otherwise would. Right? The confidence of they say mediocre white man, but these are not all men, but it's the same idea. I cite this article a lot and I need to find a new one because it's old, but they don't seem to be doing many studies on this. But like it's by, I don't know how to pronounce it, I'm not going to say it. But, it was focusing on a community language program in Minnesota. The article was published in 2008. And it goes through, and what's really innovative about it is that it asked questions of the students, it asks questions of the teachers and the administrators. And you never really see all of that, right? So it asks the students who left the program, why did you leave? And then it asked the teachers, why do you think they left? And then it confronted the teachers and the administrators with what the students said. I was like, why aren't there more studies like this? Because it's probably hard.
Yeah, it's probably very hard, yeah.
One of the reason I actually went into my doctoral program is because I used to I used to be the manager of an adult language program in Manhattan, and people left. And I was just like, why did they leave, right? And the program is free. It's not that. A lot of the students who were in the class, there was a Head Start preschool program and they were the mothers. So they were already there, right? It wasn't convenience, right? So I said, why aren't they showing up to class? And I wasn't mad. I just wanted to know that. I said, if I could figure this out, these programs have better attendance and then so on and so forth. That's literally the problem of practice that started me in my doctoral program. So this article was one of the first ones I found in my first semester. And I found in there, like, one of the things that just sort of made me sad is that the students are saying, yeah, the teachers, they don't listen to us. They don't listen to us. We tell them, we ask them what is going to be in the class and they give us unclear instructions which is implying basically they don't really respect the students. The students don't, they're empty vessels. They're not actually, going to be, especially these are adults, right? They're not children. I'm not saying children should be treated that way, but these people are adults. Right. And they're treated as though they're lesser in a lot of ways, and it's not just treating people as though they're lesser, because that could be just racism and not necessarily whiteness or white fragility or anything like that. It's when they are questioned, they just dismiss the thing. It's that part that I'm more interested in. It's not the mistreating people that interests me, which is a problem, but that happens in a lot of ways, right? That's not necessarily a white thing to mistreat people, but right. It's the whole
and yet. So good at it.
Yeah. It's the being questioned, like, hey, why don't you? And then to assume that, the way they do things is right. Because then they asked the teachers why they thought the students left, and the teachers all gave them logistical answers. Well, they can't get here. Well, they have a childcare issue. Now, these things are legitimate issues, obviously, right? But when they asked the students said, no, they just didn't respect me. And then they went back to the teachers and the administrators and told them what the students said, and they said, well, we work hard, okay? We work hard. That's always what I've heard at the beginning of this. That's why I started coming up with this, like, they're throwing up this thing like, I work hard, so therefore I cannot be mistreating people. And I'm like, that's not really how
Those
it
are
works.
Two different things.
Right.
That has nothing to do with anything. So I feel like the inability to just sort of even be questioned whatsoever, to even reflect on why something might have gone wrong, or just assuming that people are doing things for stereotypical reasons that you haven't examined whatsoever. Like, if you just like, oh, she couldn't come, she must have childcare issues. What are you just assuming she has 9 kids or something? I mean, like, she was in the class in the first place. So something worked out to get her there, right? So, I mean, I'm not saying that these things don't matter, because obviously the country doesn't treat people with small children very well, but that's not what happened in these cases. And I expect, because I could not find the people who left my class because they left, that some of these things were happening because I wasn't teaching most of the classes. I had teachers teaching the classes, and I do wonder if they felt that they weren't treated the way that they needed to be, and they left the class, but I don't actually know.
And I wonder if this is related to white saviorism. Like, why are you questioning what I'm doing? Like, I'm doing a good job here. I'm working hard. I'm saving you, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I would expect that it is, because why do people get into some of these things? Well, there's surveys, there's stats on why people get in, but of course that's why people say they get in. So they're not going to say, I want to save them. Right. But there is still this idea that, I mean, I think a lot of people, especially in language teaching, a lot of them stumble into it, because I did. Right? I was like 21. I graduated college. I was on my dad's couch, and he was mad at me. So I was like, I need to get a job. So I moved to South Korea. But like, he told me to get a job. I said, "Oh, I'll get a job," and I left the hemisphere. So that's what happened to me. And I think a lot of people, especially the ones who teach overseas, and that's a lot of the people who end up teaching the language, they just sort of like, I don't know. And then the people who are here in the States, or in Canada, if they go through like a certification program that's like a Teach for America or another type of program, there is this aesthetic of, look, you are smart. And which, we can get into what does that even mean, but that's the message, right? You're smart, and therefore you have something to give to these people, right? These people who are the dangerous minds children, right?
I was so thinking of Michelle Pfeiffer.
Yeah, exactly.
It was there.
It's like, we're going to go in there, and then after they experience you, then they will be better off. And I don't think that this is really explicitly discussed among the teachers. I think this is just sort of an undercurrent, and that's why if you bring it up to them, they'll say no. But based on their actual actions, right, then... Because one of the things that I really hate, and at first I understand why it happens, is that whenever people advertise for these programs, usually like free programs at nonprofits, which is the kind of place where I used to work, is always this like United Colors of Benetton ad with like, one person from every possible, like we have one from here and we have one from here. And, and then there's like it's like one white person who's clearly the teacher in the back, just like smiling. And that people want to be the person in that picture, because you're just like, not only am I didn't even choose to help the children. I chose to help the adults, and they still don't speak the language. Therefore, there must be something wrong with them. So, I mean, I speak more about adult teaching, but it's still true for the ones who teach the kids. It's just that that's where my lens tends to be from.
This also reminds me of Insecure.
Yeah. Oh, the whole first season first two seasons. Yeah. And I think the show started, was my last year at the nonprofit was the first year of the show. So I was just like, oh.
That's even deeper then, yeah. What changes need to happen within the field of English language teaching to decenter whiteness?
Yeah. So, presumably at some point we'll be out of our houses.
No, I don't believe you.
If you're listening to this in the future, let us know. But at that point, if we are in a place where we're going to congregate, right, which just seems so foreign now. But one of the big things is that, and people can say, well, this shouldn't be how the industry is, but it still is. So for as long as the industry is like this, where conferences and these sort of things matter, like those are a big center of the industry, right? And even now, when we're not going places and we're doing this stuff virtually, think about whose knowledge is being centered there, right? So that's who's on your panels, who's being keynoted, who's plenarying. That's not a word, but you know what I mean. And then people will hear this and say, I'll get one. I'm like, don't do that.
Yeah.
No, they'll always do that. We got one. No. Like who's running the conference is a big part of it, and think a little bit harder than, well, the person's first language isn't English. Like that's good. But what is their first? Like, you know what I'm saying? If you're gonna use the language, because I understand that language is also an access of discrimination, but of course it's really tied to race. So because you'll see people, they're like, well, these people are like TESOL will always say, well, we have international people. I'm like, you have a lot of people from Western Europe, so it's like it's not quite the same thing. So that's why conferences are a big thing. Journals are a big problem. I mean, they're a problem just in the world, but you know, they're a particular issue in this field that claims to care about students of color, racialized students. But like, I did not IRB approved, which is to say I was just doing it on my computer for fun. Last fall, I was going through journal articles specifically in language teaching just to see something. And I was going through all of the citations. This was a very boring project. I was just counting citations and then looking up the people. And there were times when I couldn't tell how the people identified, right? And some of the people are just they don't have a website because there's an old citation or something. But from the stuff that I could conclude, because sometimes you go in there and the person have written something about themselves and they'll say what race they identify as. When articles were choosing to challenge the status quo in some way, which is not really a binary between challenge and not challenge, but I've still made it a binary for the purposes of what I was looking at, somehow they end up citing a lot more scholars of color. So I think a lot of the time, if journal editors are choosing to publish things that are challenging the status quo, they're also going to get a lot more people who look different, who've had different experiences, because that's usually who wants to challenge the status quo. So, looking for different perspectives, because I understand they're blind. You can't go and find, I will have 5 of them in this art. You can't really do that. But you can look at what the aim of the article is. And even if you say, well, this is not quote unquote good enough for this journal, which we see what gets published. I don't know about that. Even if you say that it's not rigor or whatever, you can work with them, right? That's what you do. You're an editor. So go in and look for things that are challenging the status quo, or you can admit to yourself you like the status quo. And then, hey, I'd rather you admit it than start pretending. So that's a big thing. The hiring practices, we need to get away from the native speaker fallacy. This is old news and a lot of this stuff, but everybody knows, what is a native speaker, because unfortunately for students, and students are often clients in like adult language schools, they will perceive even whatever we call a native speaker as having an accent. Well, we all have accents, but they'll perceive them as having a not native accent because they're not white. So then the schools know this, and so they won't necessarily prioritize hiring a white teacher, but they'll say we need a native speaker. And you end up with the same thing. And this happens overseas, and it happens here, and this is not, one of the articles I published in the Canadian Journal, and part of the reason for that is that I think sometimes, and I know, Carrie, you can chime in on this, that sometimes Canada thinks that it doesn't have the problems that the United States has. And like a lot of the sources I've used are from Canada. So, these problems are over there too.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Yeah. So like the hiring practices, the, support in the scholarship, because, I said journals, but I'm talking about like schools, because I am finally in a program where 14% of my cohort is Black. How many people do you think are in my cohort? 7. So what do you think 14% means?
You.
That's what I was gonna guess.
Yeah. So, but they'll say our cohort is 14% Black. I'm like, okay, all right now. So, now of course my degree isn't specifically in language teaching, so it's like it's in education in general. But still, like, that is a problem. The pipeline isn't there, and then people will say, well, academia itself. Okay, fine. Yes. That's a big problem, but that's not just a language teaching problem. That's not just this field's problem. But if we want people to be challenging the status quo, and then we're going to say, well, we won't trust you unless you have this degree, well, then you got to help them get the degree or get to a place where they'll be taken seriously and so forth. And also what you're doing, what I'm doing, is that people, I think, need to really take other forms of public scholarship seriously. I'm sure you all agree with me because you're doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But I do think that I went and I did a presentation last fall on the first article I published, The Altruistic Shield, and I think there were 30 people in the room, and that was like that's like you go to a conference, like 30 people, unless you're like the keynote, 30 is like a lot. It's like, wow, you got a lot of people. And it went really well, and I recorded it for the podcast. I put on a podcast, and I got 300 people. So it's like, and that's, I mean, and I don't even have that popular of a podcast. So it's just sort of like, just putting the stuff on your computer or on the internet from your computer at home, you're going to get more people paying attention to you in many more places, although I guess everything is virtual now, but you know what I'm saying, than you do getting stuff into, a conference, even though the conferences are supposed to be super important. And then, like, people don't even really tend to read journal articles, especially if they're behind the paywall, but that's a whole other issue. So,
right.
Again, that's not specific to this field, is my point.
Actually, one of my former students specifically asked us at some point to talk about the fact that there's this native speaker prioritization in teaching English overseas. So he teaches, he might not be there anymore, but he was teaching in Japan, and that was what he noticed. So yeah, this is definitely a problem, and we need to talk about it more, but perhaps another time.
It's interesting because at least in South Korea, and this may not be true anymore, but I think it still is, but I don't know. When we were hired, we were supposed to send a picture, right? Which has nothing to do with your language, obviously. And this isn't like, as many problems as the United States has, this is illegal in the United States, right? You can't do that. I'm not saying this to be down in South Korea, because they're following a global, sort of practice, right? To want to prioritize who can be marketed in their materials, and who can they market in the materials is like, they said, actually, I found out that the ideal in both look and sound was a white Canadian woman.
I believe it.
They often, because I had friends who were white Canadian women, and like there was a brochure, it was like, my friends who teach here. Then there's a whole issue of class, in the sense that, like, I think I actually only got the job because I had like an Ivy League undergrad degree, and they were like, well, he's black, but because there weren't a whole lot of people who were hired who weren't white. I mean, there were a couple of people who were Asian, but then they had their own issues, in the sense that people were just like, why don't you speak Korean?
I also wanted to ask you about, just very briefly, because we're almost out of time, but on Twitter and in the media, you've been talking a lot about these pandemic pods. Maybe explain what pandemic pods are and why they're a problem. Yeah,
so it's changed every day, but because they're new, so people are coming up with new things, and I think also the fact that there's pushback now, the mostly white parents are like, I don't know, so they're still doing it, but they feel uncomfortable about it, which, hey, whatever. But basically, pandemic pods is that there's a spectrum on how inequitable they are, but the general gist is that it's not safe for kids to go to school in most parts of the country, and so the parents are podding up with their friends or their kids' friends, parents, you know what I mean, and bringing 3 people in one house or like 4 people in one, whatever, and they'll either hire a teacher or a tutor to teach them, and in so doing, pull them out of the public school that they're already in, or they will have someone come there and help them with the remote work that they were doing from the school. Now, hiring someone to help them with the remote work is more like sending them to a Kaplan or something. Like, it's inequitable, but it's sort of a normal kind of inequity. Pulling them out of the public school will be very bad financially for the public school, but not now, but like later. So that's, and then of course, like what's happens to the kids, like, cause some districts are like open, but everybody has the choice to pull their kids out. And then who's not having that choice is the kids whose parents got to work, or, they don't have the money to have a tutor at home or something like that. So that's one way that it really, can increase inequity. Some people say, well, because there are communities of color who are doing like sort of co-ops, but the difference is they're not like pulling their kids out of the school. And, it's also, there's more of a responsibility on white and wealthy parents to think about, the communities that they serve. And the one point I'll make, because I know we're going to run out, is that I do hear this pushback from some people who say, well, my community is almost all white, so I'm not really hurting any kids of color. And then I say, you're right. Now, why do you live in that community? Well, like, how did that happen? Yeah. Because for me, the pandemic pods, like, they're bad, but they're very much a 2020 sort of situation, the specifics of them. But they're just a symptom of a larger disease. And to me, that I would much rather you go figure out why your town is 90% white and do something about that than, if you want to have a pandemic pod this fall, go have your pod, but go fix your town.
Go fix your town.
I love that.
Oh, wow. This has been a really great conversation.
Yeah. I wish we could talk another 10 hours.
Yeah.
But do you have one last message for our listeners that you would hope they would take away from our conversation?
I promised my professor who told me about the podcast that I would mention when I was on the podcast. So I want to say thanks, Maite, for telling me about it in class, an offhand comment, and I really ran with the idea. And then otherwise, that last point I made about public scholarship, I mean, what you're all doing and what I'm trying to do, and I think that it's inevitable. It's going to take a long time, but I do think, especially all this time we're all spending online now, it is going to be really important for us to, especially as, marginalized scholars or racialized scholars, to push against the status quo in whatever way we can. And it's going to be messy, and I think people don't like that, but is the order actually working for anyone besides like two people at the top? Because it's not. So we need to push against it, and whatever mess is the result is going to be better than what we have.
100%. Yes.
It's not working for any of us.
It's not working.
Nope.
Doesn't work.
It's not working. It's not working. Well, thank you so much. This was amazing.
Yes.
We, of course, leave our listeners with one final message. Don't be an asshole.
Don't be an ass. We would like to thank our two newest patrons from last month, Sherry Griffith.
Yay.
And Andy Bouchard.
Yay, thank you. Oh, you got that French name down. You knew.
Oh, I don't know. I pronounced it with a D, so.
Oh.
Bouchard. Would be the closer to the French pronunciation.
I'm sure they're used to getting it both ways all the time.
Well,
maybe.
I'm pretty sure he's American, although I guess I don't know for sure, but I'm pretty sure he's American, so probably Bouchard.
Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate it, especially during these trying times.
Yes, seriously. Thank you so
Appreciate
much. The Vocal Fries podcast is produced by me, Carrie Gillen, for Halftone Audio. Theme music by Nick Granum. You can find us on Tumblr, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Vocal Fries Pod. You can email us at vocalfriespod@gmail.com, and our website is vocalfriespod.com.